So here we'll describe, we'll look at the the foundational theories of emotion, which are the James Lange theory and the Cannon-Bart theory. So when we think about emotions such as fear, our common sense or our intuitive understanding of the experience would be that there's a frightening situation, one that a person feels is threatening them, is frightening, in response to which they experience an emotion such as fear, resultant from which are certain behaviors and physiological effects. But the James Lange theory proposes a different perspective. So the James Lange theory of emotion asserts that emotion arises from our physiological arousal. So recall what you've learned from about the sympathetic nervous system and the fight or flight or freeze response that one experiences when they are threatened. So according to the James Lange theory, if a person were to encounter a threat in their environment, like for instance a venomous snake in their backyard, then the sympathetic nervous system would initiate significant physiological arousal. So there's been some physiological reactions, the fight-flight response, increased heart rate, and escape. And that, according to the James Lange theory, you would only experience the feeling of fear after this physiological arousal has taken place. And so the emotion that one would experience would be the interpretation, based on the interpretation of those physiological responses. So in other words, the James Lange theory describes that our experience of emotion, so our subjective experience, the feeling part, so the subjective experience, the label that we assign, that is based on our awareness of our physiological responses to emotionally arousing stimuli. So in other words, if there's a threatening stimulus, such as the sight of an oncoming car, the person would first experience a physiological state, such as a pounding heart, sweaty palms, and their interpretation of that physiological state would result in their emotion. So it's after they have interpreted, they have labeled those physiological reactions, only then do they have a subjective experience of a feeling. So they only then do they. So the Cannon-Bart theory is a rebuttal to this, to the James Lange theory that we've looked at earlier. So according to the Cannon-Bart theory, the physiological arousal and the emotional experience occur simultaneously. So when the person, for instance, sees a car in the horizon driving toward them, they feel the fear at exactly the same time that the body creates the fight or flight response. So the emotional reaction, so the feeling of fear would be separate and independent of the physiological arousal, even though they co-occur. So they're two simultaneous events. They're independent of each other. They're separate and independent of each other. And yet, but it's important to say that they co-occur. So even though they co-occur, they are separate and independent of each other. Okay, so we're going to revisit the common sense view of emotion. So this describes that for the autonomic responses to occur, we must first feel an emotion. Okay, so here's an example. So there's a stimulus such as the sound of a firecracker. Okay, and the sight of a firecracker. It makes a loud bang noise. And so we perceive that to be dangerous. So it's a signal for danger or threat that our brain interprets as being dangerous. And we then experience from this interpretation of the stimulus, the external stimulus, we then experience an emotion. So we perceive a stimulus in the environment that is threatening to us, that signals harm or danger, and we experience an emotion which is fear. So the common sense view is that first we feel fear, so the subjective feeling of fear precedes the autonomic arousal. So first we feel fear, and then we experience autonomic arousal. So heart palpitations, blood pressure rises, perspiration rises, okay? So again, first we experience the subjective feeling, so that's the feeling component of the emotion, the fear. Then we experience the physiological changes governed by the autonomic nervous system. So increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased perspiration. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to look at the earliest theory on emotion proposed by James and Lang. So I covered this earlier, but just to reiterate, this is a review with another example, another pictorial example. So here we have the James Lang theory argues that the emotions we feel are caused by bodily changes, and the emotions differ due to there being different physiological responses. So for each emotion, there's a distinct pattern of physiological responses that is unique to that emotion, that is not shared with any other emotion, is what the James Lang theory argued. So the James Lang theory proposes that there is an autonomic reaction that triggers the feeling. So the autonomic responses governed by the autonomic nervous system, which happen automatically without our conscious control, rather they are involuntary. Those reactions are what cause us to feel subjective emotions. So they are the impetus, or they are the starting point from which we can experience an emotion. So they argue that if we have a stimulus such as the loud sound of a firecracker, then our brain perceives that to be a signal for threat or danger, to which we experience the physiological responses, so racing heartbeat, increased blood pressure, increased perspiration, for example. So those are the physiological responses governed by the autonomic nervous system that we then interpret. So then we pay attention to those changes in our body, and we realize, oh, my heart is beating faster, I must be afraid. Okay, or I'm experiencing increased respiration, I must be afraid. Because according to the James Lang theory, we interpret the physiological changes in our body and we assign meaning to them. So we assign the meaning that these physiological change are indicative of the emotion of fear. So my heart is beating faster, I must be afraid. I have increased respiration, I must be afraid. Okay, so two take home message from this theory is that first we must experience the physiological changes governed by the autonomic nervous system, such as increased heart rate, increased palpitations, increased blood pressure, increased perspiration, to which we respond by interpreting them, assigning a meaning to them, and the meaning depends on the pattern of physiological responses. So we know that increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased perspiration, those are indicative of the emotion of fear. Okay, that's what the James Lang theory proposed. For every emotion, there is a distinct and unique pattern of physiological responses defining it. Okay. However, the rebuttal to that theory is that there is no distinctive autonomic pattern for each emotion. The autonomic patterns sometimes overlap, yet we get to experience different emotions. Okay, so you may be on a roller coaster ride and you will experience increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased respiration. But that doesn't mean you're afraid. In fact, you're elated, you're very happy, you're excited. Okay, at some points it is scary, but it is also, there are points at which it is exciting. And at those points, the physiological pattern overlaps with that of fear. Okay, so now we're going to look at the Cannon-Barth theory of emotion. So this theory is a rebuttal to the James Lange theory, and it posits that stimuli give rise to distinct arousal and cognitive states simultaneously. So whereas the James Lange theory argued that the physiological experience precedes the subjective emotion that we come to feel. So first we experience the physiological responses and then we experience the subjective emotion. This theory proposes that those two components of emotion occur simultaneously. So the distinct physiological arousal and the cognitive states, so that's the emotion that we fear, the subjective component of emotion, those occur simultaneously. So they insist that the brain must interpret the situation to decide which emotion is appropriate. So there's the stimulus, the loud stimulus again. So there's a perception of the external environment. So that's perceiving that stimulus as a cue for danger or as a threat signal, to which we simultaneously experience autonomic arousal. So increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased perspiration. Okay, that's the general autonomic arousal, and we simultaneously experience the emotion, which is fear. So that's, those two components occur simultaneously, and the cerebral cortex decides on the emotional response and also activates the sympathetic response. So the cerebral cortex governs both our interpretation, which is our subjective experience, what emotional response is appropriate to this situation, and also activates the sympathetic nervous system to give rise to the physiological reactions. Okay, so that happens simultaneously. Okay, so this is the first of these two theories that involves the cerebral cortex and assigns to it the role of deciding what emotional response is appropriate for the situation. Okay, so that's the Cannon-Barth theory. Okay, so now we're going to look at the third and final theory, which is the Schachter and Singer theory, also coined Schachter and Singer cognitive attribution model. So this is a theory that introduces the role of context, so the influence that context plays on our cognitive attribution of emotion to arousal. Okay, so according to this theory, first we experience a threatening cue that the brain perceives to be dangerous. So the sound of a loud firecracker, our brain perceives to be threatening or dangerous. Then we experience autonomic arousal. Okay, now it's important to state that there's a pattern of autonomic arousal that occurs to this cue, which is a specific pattern. So there's increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased perspiration, that we then come to appraise the surrounding context. So we look at the surrounding context. Is this firecracker occurring in a dark alley at night when I'm walking by myself in that dark alley, or is it occurring at a firework show? Is it occurring during a celebration at a concert. Okay, so we have to appraise the context in which it's occurring. And so then, as a result of interpreting the context, that attribution, that we experience an attribution of emotion that is responsible for the arousal. So we then interpret or attribute the emotion that governs the physiological response we experience. So if we experience increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased perspiration, and we're at a concert, it must then mean that the emotion we're experiencing, because we're in that context, is a positive one. So we must be excited, we must be thrilled, we must be happy to witness this. Okay, so the cognitive appraisal of the current situation will allow us to decide which emotion is contributing to the physiological arousal. Okay, so if we are in a dark alley, it's really late at night, and I'm by myself in the dark alley and I hear this loud sound, then the surrounding environment, dark alley, late at night, gives me reason to believe that I'm scared. That's why I'm experiencing increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased perspiration. Okay, so the context allows me to decide which emotion is responsible for the physiological arousal that I'm experiencing. So the Schachter and Singer theory describes that stimuli provoke non-specific arousal. So the pattern is the arousal is non-specific. So it meaning that it could belong, the increased sympathetic output is common to both happiness or joy or excitement and fear, right? So those are non-specific arousals, and then we experience a non-specific arousal that is cognitively labeled on the basis of the situational cues. So situational cues in one context I gave was being at a concert, an outdoor concert, and there are fireworks just to embellish or amplify the experience. There are fireworks at the outdoor concert. So that's one set of situational cues. It's a concert, everyone is happy, it's safe. But another set of situational cues is being in a dark alley late at night. Okay? So that brings us to the end of this unit.